There is a box in the Smithsonian Institution Archives. It contains 63 handwritten letters from elderly Americans, collected between 1935 and 1941, describing what daily life looked like before the railroad arrived in their communities. Before the railroad arrived, not before electricity, not before the automobile, before the railroad. The letters were solicited by a researcher named Doris Stevens. She was compiling oral histories for a project on pre-industrial American life. The project was never published. Stevens died in 1963. The box sat in the archive for decades, catalogued under a subject heading so specific that almost no one has ever searched for it. I found it because I was looking for something else. I keep saying that, but it keeps being true. I had been thinking about a mathematical problem, a simple one. An American born in 1840 who lived to the age of 95 would have died in 1935. That person was alive before the first American steam railroad carried passengers. They were a child when the Erie Canal was still the fastest way to move goods from the interior to the coast. They remembered, personally, from childhood, a version of America that most people today cannot imagine, even with photographs, because photographs didn't exist yet when that America was fully intact, and that person would have been elderly but alive, coherent, available to be interviewed, in the middle of the New Deal era, when the government was actively funding exactly that kind of documentation. How many of those interviews happened, and what did they say? The Federal Writers Project collected 2,900 life histories between 1936 and 1940. It was defunded in 1939. 3 years. They had 3 years, but there were other projects, smaller, less organized, individual researchers, state historical societies, women's clubs that had been collecting this kind of testimony since the late 19th century. The material exists, scattered across dozens of archives, in ways that make it almost impossible to survey as a whole. I have been trying. What I've pieced together from those scattered sources describes a world that doesn't match the standard account, not even close. The standard account describes pre-railroad America as isolated, slow, difficult, communities cut off from each other by the limits of horse travel and river navigation. That account isn't wrong exactly, but it's incomplete in a way that changes the picture significantly. And the people who could have corrected it, who lived through both worlds, who could have told us exactly what was lost and what was gained, are gone, all of them, gone by the mid-1950s at the latest. Abigail Whitmore was born in 1838 in western Massachusetts. She was interviewed in 1937 at the age of 99 by a researcher from the Massachusetts Historical Society, 99 years old. She remembered the 1840s. From childhood, she described market days in her hometown, weekly gatherings that drew people from 30 miles in every direction, 30 miles, on horseback in wagons, through roads that turned to mud in spring and froze in winter. They came anyway, every week. She described a credit system operated entirely through personal relationships. Her father's reputation as a reliable debtor was documented not in any bank's ledger but in the memory of every merchant and craftsman in the region, every single one of them. The record was distributed. It lived in people, not in institutions. She described buildings in the town center that she said had been there as long as anyone could remember, structures that the town's official records dated to the early 1800s, but that she insisted, based on what her grandmother had told her, were considerably older. That detail gets dismissed as an old woman misremembering. But Whitmore was coherent enough to describe the market day system in detail that historians have since confirmed is accurate. Her memory of the credit networks has been corroborated by surviving account books from Massachusetts merchants of that era. If her memory of the economics was accurate, why would her memory of the buildings be any less reliable? Josiah Harmon was born in 1842 in Ohio, interviewed in 1938. He described the community well system in his childhood town, a shared resource, maintained through what he called work parties. Every family contributed labor proportional to their use of the well. No payment, no contract, no written agreement of any kind. A system of mutual obligation that he said had operated without disruption for as long as the town had existed. The interviewer asked who kept track of who had contributed. Harmon said nobody kept track. Everybody knew. The knowledge was distributed across the entire community because everyone depended on it. Nobody could afford to let it fail, so nobody did. That system appears repeatedly in the testimonies I've found. Distributed communal knowledge replacing centralized record-keeping. It is the opposite of what the post-railroad economy required. The new economy needed documentation, transactions recorded in bank ledgers, labor tracked in timesheets, obligations formalized in contracts, everything written down, everything verified by an institution. What it replaced was a system where the documentation lived in the relationships themselves, in the people, not in the paperwork. Here is what the railroad actually changed, beyond the obvious. The first transcontinental railroad was completed by 1880. The railroad had reached into communities that had previously been days or weeks from the nearest navigable water. What it brought was not just speed, it brought standardization, the kind of standardization that the old systems could not survive. Before the railroad, time itself was local. Every town kept its own time, set by the position of the sun. Your town's noon was your town's noon, not the same as the town 50 miles away. There were approximately 300 different local times in use across the United States. 300. Before 1883, on November 18, 1883, the railroad companies imposed standard time zones on the country. They did not ask Congress. They did not ask the public. They did not pass a law. They announced that time was changing, and it did. Just like that. The railroad companies unilaterally changed the time, for everyone, in every community, without a vote, without a law, because the schedule required it. That detail matters because it illustrates what the railroad actually represented. It wasn't just infrastructure. It was a system that required uniformity. Different track gauges couldn't connect. Different time zones couldn't schedule. Different currencies couldn't price freight consistently. Different local credit systems couldn't settle accounts across state lines. The railroad demanded standardization, and standardization erased the local variations that pre-railroad communities had built over generations. It didn't destroy them through force. It made them obsolete. It made them unredeemable to the new system. And when the new system was all anyone knew, the old one became invisible. Eleanor Marsh was born in 1843 in rural Virginia. Interviewed in 1939 at 96, she described what she called the settling season, late autumn after harvest, when every debt and favor and obligation accumulated over the year was reconciled, not by a bank, not by a court, by the community itself. Gatherings that could last multiple days, disputes resolved in front of neighbors, accounts balanced through combinations of labor, goods, and sometimes nothing at all, just acknowledgement, just the agreement that things were square. She said the settling season was the most important event of the year, more important than any holiday, because it was when the community renewed itself. She said when the banks came in, the settling season stopped because now debts were held by people in offices in distant cities, people who had never met you, who could not be asked to consider what kind of year you'd had, who were not part of the community whose renewal was at stake. She didn't say this was worse, she said it was different in a way that changed everything. Martha Graves was born in 1845 in rural Tennessee. Interviewed in 1940, at 95, she said something I haven't been able to stop thinking about. She said that when the railroad came through the county, the old people cried, not because they objected to progress, she was clear about that. She said they cried because they knew. They knew that everything they had built, the arrangements, the understandings, the ways of doing things that held the community together, none of it would mean anything anymore. They would have to start over. And they were too old to start over. What did she mean by arrangements? The interviewer asked. She said the way we knew who to trust. I've read that sentence many times. The way we knew who to trust. Before the railroad, before the national banking system, before the standardized wage economy. Trust was community knowledge, distributed, maintained collectively, passed from generation to generation through direct relationships and accumulated experience. Your father knew that man's father, and what that meant. And the new system replaced all of that with documented credit scores, verified identities, institutional intermediaries, whose job was to do the trusting on everyone's behalf, for a fee, always for a fee. Whether that replacement was better or worse is not my question. My question is simpler. What was lost in the transition, and who was available to answer that question? The people who could answer it were the men and women born between 1830 and 1850, who lived long enough to be interviewed in the 1930s and 1940s. They were the last generation with direct childhood memory of the pre-railroad world. They were mostly gone by 1945. A few survived into the early 1950s, but by 1955 they were all gone, and with them went the last first-hand account of what America looked like before the railroad standardized it. The Federal Writers Project caught some of them. 2,900 transcripts, 24 states. The project was defunded in 1939. After 3 years. 3 years was all they got. The transcripts sat largely unread in the Library of Congress until the 1970s. 30 years. They are searchable now. They are readable now. I have been reading them, and I keep finding the same things. Whitmore and Harmon, and Graves and Marsh. A world organized around relationships instead of institutions. A world where the accounting lived in people, not in paper. Buildings that felt older than the records said they were. Systems of mutual obligation that required no documentation, because the community itself was the record. Those witnesses are gone, their grandchildren, who heard these stories firsthand at kitchen tables in the 1940s and 1950s, are in their 80s and 90s now. They are the last living link, not to the old world itself, but to the memory of people who lived in it. The last link in a chain that goes all the way back, and when they are gone, it ends. The transcripts are in the Library of Congress. They've been there since the 1940s. They are indexed. They are searchable. And I have to wonder, has anyone gone through all 2,900 of them, looking specifically for what the last witnesses said about the world before the railroad arrived, and replaced everything they knew with something that needed no memory at all, just documentation? The 1890 census would have captured one more layer, the generation just before Whitmore and Harmon and Graves. People born in the 1810s and 1820s, people whose parents built the pre-railroad communities, people who could have told the census takers what those communities were actually designed to do, how they actually worked. That census was destroyed. The fire in 1921, the warehouse, the 12 years, the 1933 authorization, the cornerstone laid the next day, the layer beneath the last witnesses, gone too. Maybe all of this is just progress. One world replacing another, better tools replacing old ones. The old people cried, because that is what old people do. Change is hard, loss is real, and the new system worked well enough, better than well enough. Maybe the question is sentimental. Maybe it doesn't matter what was there before. But then I read Josiah Harmon saying nobody kept track, everybody knew, and I think about what it would mean to live in a community where the accounting was in the people, where the trust was in the relationships, where no institution needed to be fed, where no intermediary extracted a fee from every exchange, where the community itself was the record. And I wonder what we actually lost when we decided that documentation was better than memory, and paper was more reliable than people, and a credit score was more trustworthy than a neighbor. The archive still has those 2,900 transcripts. Whitmore is in there, Harmon is in there, Graves is in there, Marsh is in there, and the other 2,896 voices, describing a world that the railroad didn't just replace, it made illegible, it made invisible, it made impossible to even imagine, unless you go looking. The archive remembers what the transition erased, but only if someone goes looking.